Now, if we're going to harvest all of those tomatoes at once, we want to have a plant where the vast majority of those tomatoes are all ripening at the same time. And so one of the other characteristics they were trying to breed for was that all the tomatoes would ripen about the same time. And there wasn't any kind of artificial methods used. They basically had a huge library of wild tomato plants from all over South America at UC Davis, which is California's ag school. And they crossbred and crossbred and crossbred until they came up with tomatoes that would all ripen about the same time so that you'd have a decent yield for the farmer.
So then, what was it? That's a determinate variety, correct?
Correct.
So I guess prior to that breeding, for how long were indeterminate varieties being grown?
Forever. You know, basically people would go through, like for commercial picking for canning, a farmer might have a field crew go through 3 times over a period of weeks to pick from the same plants over and over again, you know, getting the red ones first and then coming back a week or 2 later and getting those red ones, leaving the yellow ones and coming back in 2 weeks and getting those. And at the time when hand labor was cheap and available, that was something that you could afford to do. But when they ended the Bracero program in the 60s, suddenly the availability of hand labor in California ag went to zero. Well, not zero, but it was extremely tight. And farmers were stuck because they couldn't pick their tomatoes by hand because they couldn't get hand crews. Tomato canners were stuck because they couldn't get tomatoes from tomato farmers. And then the Blackwelder company out of Woodland, California, had been working with UC Davis, came up with a harvester that they were experimenting with, and finally came up with a machine that would grab the whole bush, bring it into the up on a platform, and then up to 12 people would basically pick the tomatoes off the vine and put them on a conveyor belt that took them into a trailer that was traveling next door.
And that's still what you use today. I mean,
that machine right there,
machine, but I mean, essentially that idea.
We use that. Basically the idea of grabbing the entire plant off of the ground, taking it up, shaking out the tomatoes, throwing the plant back on the ground, throwing the yellow tomatoes on the ground, dirt clods on the ground, and only taking red ones to the cannery is the way that we do it today. And it's the same way that tomato processing is done in much of the world. The one exclusion to that might be Southern Italy if they're still doing hand-picked tomatoes. But those tomatoes will typically be quite expensive because hand labor in Europe, just like any place else, is very expensive.
And I should mention at this point that the San Marzano DOP tomatoes, which is a totally problematic tomato anyway, that maybe we'll cover in a minute, but that those San Marzano DOP tomatoes are, if they're to be marked DOP, they are to be picked by hand, which means 3 separate rows. If you go by those fields, then they're up on stakes and there's string so you can see the sections that they'll pick separately. And to be, as Steve just said, to be picked by hand, it's going to be quite expensive. So when you go to the grocery store and you see DOP San Marzano tomatoes for $1.99 a can, something's wrong. There's tons of fraud with those tomatoes in America, but just in an ideal world, if that tomato is what it says to be, then those are the hand-picked ones. And Alec, I want to bring you into this for a second. Alec is from Tomato Wellness. Alec, can you first of all, congratulations. Sarah just had a baby.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I know you know that. I'm not telling you, but.
Yeah, very well rested.
Yeah, can you, that's why I'm amazed you're in this for the whole time. I texted you right before I went on to be like, hey, let me know if you ever want to plan to come on. Yeah. And then here you are. This is even better.
Surprise.
Yeah, no, it's great. Because I in the first few weeks that we did this, there were special guests kind of popped up unexpectedly. And I was like, oh, maybe I should plan them. But things get too busy. So can you tell us what is tomato wellness, and I guess what is going on in the tomato industry right now? Because you see the whole, for everybody else watching, Steve is at Stanislaus Food Products, and Alec is with Tomato Wellness, which is an industry tomato organization.
Yeah, basically we're the commodity board for the entire tomato products industry. So everything canned, jarred tomato products, we represent the whole U.S. And the idea is to help promote, educate, share the health benefits, and also educating people about how to use canned tomatoes and about all that goes into it, and also shedding light on what Steve and the farmers are doing behind the scenes. Because a lot of times with canned tomatoes, people are, there's a little bit more of a stigma, I guess, of not understanding where this can came from. And so what we try to do is make it really clear to see, oh, this is a third generation farmer that has his hand in the dirt and trying to explain all the work that goes into it to get the the harvester and all the technology that's behind this idea to really get back to agriculture and the farm and the people that are growing these great products that are healthy and are picked at their peak of freshness so that you can enjoy them all year long. Because I think with almost anything these days, people forget about seasonality, and they think that the right answer is to always be fresh and when you try to explain like a can, it feels like that's a derogatory term or something. It's like, no, it's a seasonal fruit that we're catching right at its peak, and then we seal it and we lock it in within hours so that we can have that flavor all year long. And so what we try to do is communicate that to consumers and help all of our members to promote their products and help to tell their stories.
So you mentioned a big difference between tomato as a fresh product and tomato as a canned product. We can buy tomatoes year round in the grocery store. What's the difference between the fresh tomatoes that we're buying in a grocery store and the tomatoes that are in the can?
Well, and I think it's like any fruit or vegetable. I mean, we're all old enough to remember when you could go to a grocery store and you could only get certain things at certain times of year. Nowadays, you go to the grocery store and you can always go get a watermelon. You can always get a tomato. These things, but they only grow at certain times of year, and people are surprised to learn that. And so what you're getting in a grocery store when you go and buy a fresh tomato in January or April, or you're getting either something that was cooked in a hot house, which generally I personally don't feel like they have the same flavor of a summer ripe tomato, or you're getting something shipped from halfway around the world. I mean, it could be coming from Chile or Mexico or other parts where what generally happens with, and even in season, what you get at the grocery store are generally fresh tomatoes that were picked when they're still green. And then because they know it's going to take about 2 weeks to get to a grocery store. And so in that time, they will either slowly turn red or they'll gas them, but they never have that real flavor of, their peak of flavor and freshness. And so that's where with the canned industry, we often talk about a canned tomato. Often you're going to get a fresher tomato, even though it's coming out of a can, because it was sealed within 3 to 6 hours versus that fresh tomato that just was trucked, from Florida to Michigan and sat on a grocery shelf for a couple weeks. It's like, it just doesn't have that same flavor. So we try to kind of, educate people about seasonality and the speed of the canned industry, of how quickly they're sealed and locking in that peak flavor. And that surprises a lot of people. Again, people often think that the right answer, like if we go to a restaurant and we say, oh, the salsa is great, where did you get your tomatoes? The poor waiter often thinks that the right answer is, oh, we only use fresh tomatoes. And we're like, it's the middle of March. Like, where did you get a good fresh tomato? And so they just think that that's the right answer. So we're trying to kind of get people to be aware. No, actually, if you're cooking 100% of the year, you should be probably using a canned tomato for the most consistent flavor. And especially if it's not, June, July, and it's coming from somewhere nearby your house, you're always going to get a better flavor from a canned tomato. And so that kind of surprises people. But I think the next generation of millennials are more into canning. I think people are kind of getting seasonality, and it's kind of becoming a little bit more aware. I think people are kind of catching on to it, but it was kind of an uphill battle when we first started this. People thought cans were bad, that we're adding all of these things. I've had people yell at me before about GMO tomatoes, and I just said there aren't GMO tomatoes. Like, that's not a thing. And they were pulling their phones out to prove me wrong, and we had to go, and I had to show them the list of actual GMO products and show them that this wasn't even that's not a thing. And but people just have this perception around cans, so that's what we're kind of just trying to educate people around.
What about educating people about? I know both of you guys are obviously biased in this, the California and Italian and whatever other tomatoes, but how do you educate people about source of their tomatoes, whether it be an Italian tomato or like where you both represent, which is California?
Hey, Scott.
Yes, sir.
I would say ignore where it came from. Tear the label off, open the can and taste it. And if it tastes good, figure out where it came from and get some more.
Yeah.
Paper authenticity is both. There are bad tomatoes canned in California. There are bad tomatoes canned in Italy. It's like saying that if you go to France, you're going to get good brie. I guarantee you can get crappy brie in France. So paper authenticity doesn't mean anything. It depends on what tastes good. But I can tell you this: if a product costs exceptionally low, it doesn't matter where it came from. It's probably not going to taste good.
Yeah.
But what are you going to be out a couple bucks because you bought a can? Spend a couple bucks, give it a taste. If it tastes really good, buy some more.
It's great advice. Speaking of purchase advice, what do people do when they see diced, puree, crushed, whole peel tomatoes? Is there a difference between the actual tomatoes in those cans besides what they look like? Or is there a physical difference between the fruits themselves and the processing?
I can't speak for any other packer, but it's Stanislaus Food Products. And for anybody who's watching and has never heard of us, we only pack restaurant-sized cans. We happen to be the #1 choice of independent pizzerias across the U.S. But for us, the only difference in our tomatoes is if we're making a true plum tomato, like the Alta Cucina that you showed a picture of early on, or a Valoroso tomato, which is a true plum tomato, those are different seed stock, they have a different texture, they have a different flavor. But when it comes to puree and diced and all those other things, the same great tomatoes are going into everything. We may choose to test the tomato to see how it peels. If it peels well, then we may make a whole peel tomato with it, or we may make a diced tomato because diced tomatoes have no peel. But if the peels don't come off well, we may just grind it up and make puree.
And when you say test it, do you mean per lot that comes in?
We do it every trailer load that comes in. We'll take a sample out of the trailer and we'll do a slip skin test. And a lot of the cooks who are watching have probably done slip skin with tomatoes. You put tomatoes in nearly boiling water until the skin kind of wrinkles up. And then you can put it under cold water and take your fingers off the skin and it pops the skin right off. It's kind of the home way of peeling tomatoes. And we'll do that and we'll see how many of the tomatoes peeled well and how many did the skin stick, and that's how we'll decide.
Now, I got to show you this. I don't know if you're looking on a phone or if you're looking on a laptop, Steve and Alec, but
I'm looking at a phone, but
you can see this. This is a document from 1956 of a tomato packer in California, and it's just a listing of their products that they packed in these years. And it's pretty fascinating to me, and this is why I bring it up in this lecture, is because we see round tomatoes being canned up until it turns to 0 in the mid-50s, and at that same time period, we see a pizza sauce product go from non-existent to suddenly some actual numbers on the list. I just thought this is pretty cool to bring it up.
Actually, there's a common sense explanation for a lot of that. back in the 30s and 40s, what got imported from Italy? You had two different items that got imported. You got paste, tomato paste, and you had whole tomatoes. And your restaurants that wanted to make their own sauce, they wanted to buy whole tomatoes and grind them down themselves to know what they were getting. Because tomato canners can pack whole tomatoes in like a heavy puree that sticks to the tomatoes, and it looks like everything in there is red. But as the old school guys in New York do, you take your whole tomatoes, you put them in a mulino, a hand mill, and you grind them down, and you figure out what was left when you're done. And did you have a bunch of yellow shoulders? Did you have hard cores? Or was it nice and smooth and everything went through? As packers in the U.S. Kind of progressed and tried different things, they learned that they could make things like a pizza sauce or a concentrated crushed tomato. It wasn't as thick as a tomato paste, but it basically cooked down tomato juice. And pizzerias, for example, said, hey, this looks like a cheaper way for me to make good tasting sauce than grinding up tomatoes by hand and cooking them down. And by the way, canners can do that at a lower temperature, so the pizza sauce tastes more like pizza. But over time, the canners came up with more and more variations on, piece size and how thick was it packed in and all those different things. And the consumers in the U.S. responded by finding ways to use it.
Are there parts of the country that are more likely to use a specific product of yours than other parts? Like, is there one part of the country that's all about puree, one that's whole peeled? What's the split like?
Sounds like kind of a leading question, Scott. Basically on the East Coast, okay, everything Baltimore north, they start their pizza sauce with what we call pizza sauce. It's got concentrated crushed tomato. There's a little bit of seeds in there for texture. It's the same thickness as a puree, but it's a little pulpier. Not probably something that you and I would notice, but someone who's been working with it for 30 years says, "Oh, absolutely, I wouldn't use anything else." So up and down the East Coast, they would use a concentrated crushed tomato, had little seeds. If they're in the Ohio River Valley, if they're in Chicago, they only would start with a puree. Never would use anything with seeds in it. It's just, it would be an abomination to have seeds in your sauce. And it's funny because our brand, we have a brand called Full Red, and in New York, if you say Full Red, people know that you mean pizza sauce. If you're in Chicago and you ask for Full Red, people know you mean puree. And same name, but two different regions, and so they each have their favorites. Now, the other piece of that is both regions have turned in recent years to adding ground tomatoes to their pizza sauce instead of water. Old school pizza guys used to get a really thick pizza sauce and add a ton of water to it because it would be more economical and have stretch. But what they figured out was, if instead of water you add, like in New York, you add a ground unpeeled tomato to your pizza sauce base, which is pretty thick, and you make it thinner or juicier by adding ground unpeeled tomatoes, you get the vine fresh green aroma notes of a ground tomato, and you get the sweetness from the concentrated crushed or the pizza sauce. And by not adding any water, you basically are getting the tomatoes without the additional heat that would happen if you made it thicker and then added water back. So flavorful sauces start with a thick sauce, and then they add basically a juicy, chunky tomato back to it until it reaches the thickness that they want on their crust. In Chicago, instead of a ground unpeeled tomato, they prefer a ground peeled tomato because it's got a smoother consistency, and I suppose it's from the same base, the same reasons.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
If you want one more piece of trivia there. When in the 1940s and 50s, pizza sauce was the thickened product pizzerias buy as pizza sauce was introduced to the marketplace. any place where there was a pizza history, the places you talked about where Italians had come in the 1800s, you went around and you said, hey, who uses a lot of tomatoes? Pizzerias. Hey, guys, what would you use this for? We'd make pizza. So it became known as pizza sauce. But places like the South, like where there were no Italians, the Virginias and in through Tennessee and whatnot, to this day, the same products are sold as concentrated crushed tomatoes. It's the exact same product, but it's a different label because at the time, salespeople would go out and talk to someone about, how are you going to make your mulligan stew or whatever, and they'd say, I'd buy it, what's it called? And they said, well, it's a concentrated crushed tomato. They wouldn't have known what to do with a pizza sauce, but it's exactly the identical item with a different label.
Are you talking Stanislaus products or just general tomato
I'm talking
companies?
about in general.
That's fascinating.
In the same way, if you go north of the international border and you go into Canada, pizza sauce is not a legal thing there. It's not a legally identified product. So they sell it as concentrated crushed tomatoes.
Which is the same as our pizza sauce.
Which is exactly the same as our pizza sauce. It's a thick, sweet tomato product with a little bit of seeds in it.
That's wild. That's awesome. Well, look, listen, I realize people have been hanging in here for like an hour and a half at this point. So
you're going to talk about pizza?
Listen, Steve, that I could go all night with this, but I want to open the door for anybody who has any questions. You can unmute and just ask, or you can type them in the Zoom chat. Alec Wasson is here. Steve Rouse is here. This is a great opportunity to get some questions answered about tomatoes. Yeah, if you have a question, jump in there. Otherwise, I'll try to wrap things up as quickly as I can. But the three of us could sit here talking about pizza for an eternity. And Subu, you were with us last week. I have a feeling you could be here as well.
Well, and I'll add on that on the link I just sent. It's just on. It was an interview with the author of that Tilly Lewis book.
Oh yeah.
She did give me an update when this pandemic just started, and she just said, this is actually very similar to the time that Tilly Lewis started this whole thing, and it had to do with trying to find a healthy way for people to eat in these crazy times, when back then, they didn't have food delivery, I'm sure, like we do now, where you could just order up anything from Uber Eats. And back then it was like they didn't have access to these type of foods that we take for granted. And that was what really got her started on this. How do we create healthy, sustainable foods that people can store in their cupboard, for these hard times? And I thought it was kind of a weird similarity to the times we live in now.
Totally. I should also bring up for everybody, just for some reference point for this, Tilly Lewis, around the time of the flu in the late 19-teens, was in Brooklyn and an importer. And then later in I think it was the 50s or the 60s, she was famous for having like a line of like health food products. And she became really famous for that. So the really interesting storyline about it. Subu just asked a couple questions too. One of them is asking about the history of the calzone. Is it the same as pizza? Do you guys know any detail about? I mean, calzones kind of historically have no tomato on the inside of them. So I wonder if you guys even respect calzones.
Oh, I respect the hell out of calzones, especially if you put them with a big bowl of tomatoes.
To dip it in, but yeah.
Yeah, if you all can't tell.
Yeah, and the reason.
Yes, Steve?
Yeah, and the reason that you don't put tomatoes on the inside of a calzone is it would make it too wet. There's no place. It's surrounded by dough on all sides, and so there's no place for moisture to really come out of the pie. It's basically a pizza that's been wrapped on itself.
Yeah.
One of the things that's important about a flat pizza is that there are ways for the moisture from the tomatoes to escape, and actually the tomatoes can moderate the temperature of how the dough is cooking.
Totally. I should say one thing about the calzone as well, just in terms of tomato, is that even though tomato on the inside is maybe no bueno, but putting a little bit of tomato on top, and then a little bit of a cut for steam release. I made one a couple weeks ago, a little tomato on top, and that, flavor of like that reduced little
Hey,
bit of
Scott,
tomato?
the reason that tomato has been so closely associated with pizza and Italian food is that you early on talked about Neapolitan foods basically being made out of really cheap, flavorful ingredients. Tomatoes are a really cheap, flavorful ingredient. And so, you know, basically you can take a starch called flour and you can top it with this tomato, and suddenly it's worth eating. It's not just, you know, pasty and dry. So you know, a lot of the peasant foods that we love today, whether they're Italian or even Mexican, oftentimes have a lot of tomatoes involved because tomato is a condiment. It's a source of flavor. You add a little bit, doesn't cost much, and it makes it taste a lot better.
That's a good point. I mean, you think ketchup and salsa and extra sauce? Yeah, that's a really good.
That's why I can never understand why anybody. I can almost see why people would use cheap cheese, because then you save a lot of money, and it's still garbage pizza. But like, I can understand, but I don't understand using bad tomatoes because the difference in price is like so little from one to another that it just seems like, why waste your time?
It's like 2 or 3 pennies a pie.
Yeah, I don't get it. Wait, there's other questions coming in about, let's see, about when did home pizza delivery get started? And then Terrence also asked, what's so bad about pineapple on pizza? Nothing's bad about pineapple. We'll forget that. We'll forget that question. But home delivery is, there's takeout happening in the 30s, and then home delivery kicks in after the Second World War, really kicks in a high gear in the late 50s and early 60s. And free delivery from like local independent pizzerias was already happening before Domino's ever happened. But Domino's brings it into a bigger thing. They start targeting college campuses and then opening up around the Midwest. So pizza delivery really goes back to the 30s.
Basically, it goes back to the economic boom after World War II when Americans could start affording automobiles and therefore could deliver with an automobile.
Yeah, but that's when. Yeah, but it started. I mean, if we're going to say when did it start, it started back in the late 1700s with the stufa. Like pizza delivery was always part of the process. It's not like it was a restaurant food first. It was delivery and street food.
Right.
Then it becomes a restaurant food. But yeah, having pizza boxes everywhere. Post World War II, for sure. Subu's asking, what are 3 good pizza history books to read? You guys got any recommendations for pizza history books? I got a couple back here.
The stack I've got, the stack I have is pretty big, but you're the expert on.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I do want to say, okay, a couple of things I'll recommend for Italian cuisine. Oh yeah, for Italian cuisine in general, Delizia is an incredible book. It kind of talks about like the political history of food in Italy. This one is specifically called Garlic and Oil, Food and Politics in Italy. There's a great section about the tomato in here and about like page 77. I have a bookmark in it because I love reading about tomatoes. Pizza in New Haven is an incredible book. Tons of primary source stuff in it, like real deal information, not fluff. There are some fluff pizza history books out there, which I enjoy, but they're not the ones I'll talk about right now. And then Alec, you just held up that book, Ripe.
Yeah.
Dude, I'm way into Ripe. That's by Arthur Allen. Sorry, guys, my light is being an issue. Ripe by Arthur Allen. Twinsies, Alec. We're twinsies. I love that book. I love the Tomato in America is a great book. Tomatoland by Barry Estabrook is a good book about the tomato industry and talks about the fresh tomatoes of Immokalee, Florida, and kind of comparing the fresh tomato industry of Florida to the canned tomato industry of California. I'm talking about how much worse the fresh tomato industry is. And then there's Pomodoro, the history of the tomato in Italy. All super good books.
Good books. I remember when that Tomatoland book came out, I remember being kind of nervous because it obviously was such a aggressive, piece of investigative journalism. But they do say, I think in the second paragraph, this is the fresh industry based out of Florida and completely different. And that's why as a tomato council, we're only canned and jarred tomatoes. And it's because they're just different animals. They've got kind of different issues that I'm glad that we don't have to deal with. And it's nice that they separated it in that book very clearly.
Yeah, he makes it really clear, because picking a tomato and having it get to a grocery store and be in any kind of shape to be eaten, such a different task from, as you said, Alec, picking the tomato off the vine and between 3 and 6 hours having it in a can and done. Totally different. And this is why I know it feels like an uphill battle, because people think fresh is good and canned is bad. But once you look at the actual industry, a tomato taking 2 weeks or whatever it is to get from a hothouse or a green or whatever to a grocery store, and what conditions it must be in for it to work, and then a tomato going into a can within 6 hours. I mean, canned tomatoes. On my tours, people always say, "Oh, this sauce is so great. Are they making their own sauce from fresh tomatoes?" And I have to pull it back and say, well, it's their own sauce, but they're never fresh. They're always these canned tomatoes because it's February.
Yeah.
And they're just crushing down Alta Cucina tomatoes and adding a little tiny bit of salt and not cooking them. You don't get any fresher than that, crushing up the tomato and putting it on the pie. By the way, Terrence also just mentioned there's a book called The New York Pizza Project. That's a great book. Not so much about history, but it's like images and stills of New York pizzerias. So it's really, really evocative. Like it's, I mean, come on, if you just want to look at pictures of booths like this, amazing book. Written by 5 childhood buddies from New York who just have a passion for pizza here. Subu asked, has there been an uptick in canned tomato sales to pizzerias during the pandemic?
I think it depends on what kind of pizzeria it is. If the pizzeria was already in the takeout and delivery business, many of them have had increases in business. If a lot of their business was sit down and, you know, enjoy a cocktail and that sort of thing, a lot of their businesses have been off because they haven't had the ability to have people come in and sit. And a lot of people aren't necessarily used to going to that place for takeout or for delivery pizza. Kind of depends.
I think everybody realizes that, I mean, restaurants are all really hit hard. And the best thing you can do is support your local restaurant by ordering takeout, delivery, by, you know, gift certificates, anything like that. Pizzerias are equipped for this, at least the ones that have takeout and delivery. So please make use of them and support independent pizzerias. You know, always do that. Great ways to do it. Look online. The Slice app is a good way to do it. Get pizza from independent pizzerias through them. The final question that we're going to answer right now is a real good one from Subu. He's asked this question, which reminds me of, you know, when I went towards Stanislaus, I see my favorite room in the whole thing, this one big room just filled with people putting basil leaves into the cans by hand, not a machine doing it. And I love this part, but Subu's asking, why are there basil leaves in the cans?
Basil and tomatoes have very complementary flavors. They appear a lot in Italian cuisine. And the technical answer is that basil, fresh basil, adds an enzymatic sweetness. It's not a sugar sweetness, but it makes the tomatoes taste a little sweeter, a little mellower, and it's a flavor that's really Italian.
Is there any truth to the taxation explanation of basil leaves, how they used to be added to cans of tomatoes to shift their tax declaration from imported agricultural goods to a preparation for a sauce? Any fact behind that?
Well, I do know that in the, I believe it was the 1990s, there were some import taxes on whole tomatoes from Italy, and one of the ways that they were getting around it is they were adding basil and making sure it was labeled as like seasoned tomatoes, because that put it in a different category. But putting basil in cans was around a long time before those taxation issues.
Why
it just
did they
makes the
never?
tomatoes taste better.
But then why didn't they ever indicate it on the cans?
Why didn't they indicate that it's in there?
Yeah, I mean, I have all these labels and I keep looking at all these can labels and I never saw any reference to, now it always says, so many of the cans say with basil leaves, but that didn't really creep up until maybe the 80s or the 90s.
There, a lot of canneries in California and whatnot were canning for the general population, not just Italians. And so, they went with what was popular for American consumers that weren't necessarily of an Italian extraction.
And now I see all kinds of canned tomatoes that don't have that basil leaf in there. And I know that
it depends on what you're using it for. Depends on what you're using it for. Sometimes restaurants will take exception to the fact that they find leaves in the can because it means that somebody has to pay attention and fish them out. When you're making pizza sauce, it doesn't matter because pizza sauce is typically paired up with a crust and cheese and all those other things, and so you don't notice if you see some little green leaves.
Right.
But occasionally we still will get a phone call from someone who isn't familiar with basil and tomatoes, and they're telling us there are tomato leaves in the can, and we ask them to read the label out loud, and then they get quiet, and then they say, why would you put that in there? And then we explain that it adds sweetness and it makes it taste good.
Why would you get mad about that? Okay, listen. I know people are listening and it's been rambling on long enough. We could really go forever. I want to compliment you guys on both wearing red shirts. Thanks for getting the memo about that. Tomato red shirts for all of us. Final thing I want to ask, Steve, are you in a sauna right now? I've been thinking it the whole time.
I'm actually in the laundry room.
You got banished. You should have said, yeah, I'm having a schwitz.
Yeah, I was
While you're
jealous.
sitting on the floor. Look at you. Listen.
Yeah, we use fresh basil to whip our backs.
Yeah, you should. Why not? I'm just thinking it. I know Alec's thinking it.
There, yeah.
This has been such a treasure, such a treat. Thank you guys for, I know you didn't realize that this was going to have to happen, but I can't see you in the room and not pull you in to talk. How can I sit here talking about tomatoes when I got the two of you here? So thanks for being here.
Exactly.
Thanks for everybody for sticking around and watching. And any other questions you have, Tomato Wellness on Instagram. Alec is always there responding to questions like that. Stanislaus Food Products. What's the other handle? Delicious Tomato Sauce?
No. Beautiful red sauce.
Beautiful Red Sauce. Sorry. Beautiful
Red Sauce on Instagram or Facebook, or at Stanislaus Tomatoes on Instagram or Facebook.
There you go. Look at all that.